Hello everybody, and this is Peter Svidler with my final wrap-up of the World Chess Championship match, which just finished in New York. Today we saw the rapid tiebreaks between Magnus Carlsen and Sergey Karjakin. The rules were pretty simple, 4 rapid games. If those finished 2-2, the players would then proceed to play micro matches of 2 games of Blitz. Up to 5 of such micro matches, and if all of those micro matches would finish in a draw, then there would be an Armageddon game, which would determine the eventual winner. And there's a lot of material to cover, and I will not be doing an in-depth analysis of every single game, but still there's a decent amount of material to cover. So let's start with the chess. In the first game of the tiebreak, Karjakin was white, and as was the norm in this match, he opened with 1e4, and once again we saw Ruy Lopez with Magnus sticking to his repertoire once again, not going for any kind of Berlins, and playing the main line with bishop e7. Sergey once again played 6d3, and in this position Magnus played b5, d6, a3, castles, knight c3. We have seen all of this on a number of occasions in this match actually, and I will continue working on this. And here Magnus was the first to deviate from pretty much everything by playing knight b8. I was frankly completely unaware of even the existence of this move, which somehow passed me by, but Jan pointed out during the live show that Wesley So seemingly played this a couple of times recently. It's a slower move, and I'm not sure if it aims at complete equality, but it does lead to very difficult strategic positions, which I think Magnus was very happy to get, and it also, I think, succeeded in taking Sergey out of his preparation to a large degree. Knight e2, c5, knight g3, knight c6, c3, rook b8, h3, a5. All of this is logical. You can discuss intricacies of these move orders, but there are more games to come, so I will come to the more important points. Here Sergey played a4, which we thought was not necessarily required. For instance, you can already play, I think, d3, d4 in this position if you want, and it looked to me like a very logical move here, although perhaps black can play something like a4, bishop a2, and I don't know, queen c7, and claim that this is a good edition of the normal Chigorin positions black sometimes gets. But after a4, b4, rook e1, bishop e6, it also looked like black should be reasonably comfortable. Sergey played a very interesting and I think a very good move in this position. It's very likely that white will eventually have to take on e6, but he decided to make sure that he prepares this capture and only does it when all of his pieces are properly coordinated. So he started with bishop c4, inviting black to take, after which he will compromise his chances of, ever creating any counterplay in the center. So Magnus played h6, stopping knight g5, and generally it's a useful move in all these structures. Bishop e3, queen c8, queen e2, rook d8, all of this is logical. Bishop takes e6, and we expected that if black plays queen c8, he probably aims to take on e6 with the queen, but Magnus still took with a pawn, to which Sergey replied with d4, and it looked for a second like perhaps white made some serious progress, because compared, for instance, with the immediate capture on e6, which, among other things, if you play d4 straight away, would allow a very sharp reply in takes, and c4, creating a very important pawn majority on the queen side, and white would need to do something very fast here in order not to drift into an unfavorable position. The way Sergey has prepared this trade on e6 and d4 means that black will now have to trade off all of his pawns in the center, and the game did reach this position, and it looked for a second that white will actually achieve something, because e4, e5 in many positions here will be an unpleasant positional threat, and also the pawn on a5 may find itself under pressure. But Magnus still had things under control. Rook b4, rook c1, queen d7. And this perhaps was the final moment for Sergey to at least ask a question, because he could play queen d1 here, protecting the bishop on d4 and the pawn on a4 and creating a very unpleasant threat of bishop c3, to which black probably would need to find a very precise move, rook c8, once again attacking the white pieces, and the tactical justification is bishop c3, rook c4, bishop a5, black just swaps everything down, and the pawn on a4 is once again removed from the board with complete equality. In the game, Sergey played bishop c3, and after rook a4, bishop a5, rook a1, rook a1, rook a8, the game continued for another 10 moves, but there really isn't very much here to play for either side. And with that, the match started with a reasonably quiet, well-played, potentially theoretically important draw, but not the kind of exciting, mistake-strewn, time trouble influenced fight we expected. But we got plenty of those in the following games. So that's game one. After game one, the score was still level, with Magnus Carlsen having the white pieces in the second game. That was also an e4, e5 game, but here Magnus decided not to continue discussing the Spanish and played bishop c4. For a while they were still repeating one of the games they played in the classical portion of the match. But then in this position Magnus decided not to play before bishop a7 and rook e1, and started with rook e1, which is interesting to a degree, because once again he gave black this opportunity to play knight g4, rook e2 and king h8, followed up with f5 soon thereafter. But Sergey decided not to take it, because here maybe d4 is an important tempo that you can win with white. And after bishop a7, the invitation had been withdrawn. White played h3, knight e7, d4, knight g6, knight d2, c6, bishop f1, and we reached a position in which I think objectively white cannot claim any kind of an advantage. But what he wants to get here is a playable position with plenty of pieces on the board, and that is actually very difficult to prevent. Black played a5, aiming against white's possible expansion on the queen side. Magnus, after some serious thought here, took on e5. Probably, I think maybe one of the reasons for that is that if white plays something like queen c2, there is an option for black to switch to this type of structure, which sometimes leads to very, very sharp positions in which black can even be better, because the counterplay connected with f6, knight hf4, and so on is can get very, very dangerous if black is fast enough. Anyway, d5 is what Magnus settled on. D takes e5, queen c2, bishop e6, knight c4, queen c7. All this looks perfectly logical. And here he went for a kingside expansion, trying to gain some space on that flank and also create some squares for his pieces. Takes, takes. And black could perhaps ignore this, but Sergey went for, the most forcing approach, trying to equalize immediately. And Magnus in this position played knight e3. And black was faced with a somewhat unpleasant dilemma, because if you go for what Sergey eventually went for, you are very likely to end up in a very unpleasant and strategically risky position if the complications don't work out for you. But white wants to, the immediate threat is of course a takes b5, but if black plays something like queen d6, he needs to evaluate variations, for instance starting with rook d1, queen takes b4, bishop a3, or even maybe a5, queen takes b4, bishop a3, which lead to huge messes, such as, for instance, this position, which I don't really know how to assess. Black gets 2 pawns for the sacrificed exchange, has now very strong bishops on a7 and d6, but white also obviously has a large trump for the future in the passed pawn on a5, and it's very, very difficult to assess who is better. But it's also, I guess, very difficult to opt for this with black, because it's a very, very committal decision and there are other options available. And in the end, Sergey went for the option which is perhaps the most forcing. He played bishop ba4, rook takes a4, and now he's taken on e3. And here Magnus also picked up the gauntlet, so to speak. You can take with the rook here, and white will still remain somewhat better. But of course, This is a slightly awkward move, and you would really, really like to take with the bishop, especially if you can follow it up with knight d2, and then white will be very seriously better long term here, because the pawn on c6 is a lot weaker than the pawn on b4, and white already has the pair of bishops to look forward to. But this move allows takes, takes, and knight takes e4, and this needed to be assessed properly and evaluated. b5, which would be a very attractive move, doesn't really work because black can play knight c3, b6, knight takes a4, and rook c8, and this holds for black. Therefore, Magnus went rook c1, bishop d5, b5, and here Sergey made a practical decision which I couldn't really quite understand during the game, because the position he went for, he must have known will be very, very difficult to hold. And he had an alternative in c6, c5, which we did not really have time to properly analyze during the live show, and I still am not entirely sure what's going on here. But it doesn't really feel like black should be doing all that badly here. Therefore, I could not really quite understand why Sergey opted for c takes b5, which runs into queen takes e4, queen c1, and queen d5. And this position, if you imagine the same position, let's say after queen c7, queen takes b5, if the queens come off immediately, it's very close to a complete draw. And as you will see, if the queens come off and even with the pawn on e5 gone, winning their position becomes very difficult. But it's almost impossible to trade the queens off here for black. And with the queens on, the fact that white has 4 pieces on the board compared to black's 3 means that in most cases white will be able to create a very, very serious attack on the king side. And this is how the game continued for a while. Rook b8, Magnus won some time by placing the queen on a2 and stopping even rook b1 for the time being, h6. And once h6 had been played, he transferred the queen back to e4. And in this position, maybe starting with bishop c4 was even stronger, but queen e4 is also fine. And black probably needs to immediately start challenging this queen by playing rook b4. But once Sergey played queen f6, I think, in particular, if you consider that Magnus had something like 10 minutes, I believe, against maybe a minute and a half for Karjakin in this position. Had Magnus played h4 here, I think the game would have been very, very... it would be very difficult for Sergey to survive very far past move 40, because he has immediate problems to solve here, and it's very likely that white will just roll black over here and finish the game with some kind of a mating attack on the king side. Magnus, though, went with g3, rook c8. Already there is an idea of queen c6. You can't really call it a threat, but it's an important idea, trying to challenge the queen from its marvelous post on e4. Bishop d3, queen c6, queen f5, rook e8. And here, for instance, white could play h4, meaning to meet e4 with knight g4, and he's still doing very, very well. But Magnus played bishop e4, queen e6, queen h5, knight e7. And here we sort of enter the second phase of the game. Magnus decided not to really calculate the move knight g5, which was probably very strong here, and went for the endgame, which arises by force after queen e5, takes, takes, knight g6, bishop g6, and rook takes e5. And I'm not entirely sure how this endgame should be assessed. With the bishop and knight against the rook and 3 pawns on one side, I think it's universally accepted to be a draw with precise play from the weaker side. But with the bishops, of course, white's winning chances increase quite seriously. But I'm still not sure if this is winning with best defense. Magnus did make a lot of progress, though. He did eventually push the rook away from the 5th. Got the king deep inside enemy territory here, and finally settled on this plan of planting the king on g6. But somewhat inexplicably in this position, he decided that he needs to play king g6 straight away, although he could continue making useful waiting moves. Something like bishop e3 might be a move here. Even f3, for instance, is definitely something white can play here if he wants. But he went for king g6, rook b2, bishop f5, rook f2, bishop e6 check, and king h8. And this now becomes very much a question of concrete calculation, because With the f2 pawn gone, white can no longer really plan to improve his position quietly. He needs to make sure he wins sort of here and now. And after bishop d6, rook e2, Magnus for some reason decided not to play king f7, which does look extremely promising. I wonder if he was worried about the variation like this. Bishop f8, rook a7, check, king g6, and here f6, f5. Because otherwise, if you don't play f5, white plays g4, then he plays h5. And mainly bishop f7 is a huge threat. And after f5, perhaps he didn't see the immediate win and decided not to get involved with this because he was worried that it will let some of his advantage slip. But after bishop g4, which is what he chose, the position probably is objectively a draw. Because he will, if black plays correctly, he will no longer really get this setup. Because black will always have some tempi to attack his bishops and to give a check from the 7th, followed up by chasing the bishop away from the f8 square. And this is how it should have continued. White played bishop b4 here, and black should play rook c6 here, stopping bishop e6 check. But instead, somewhat inexplicably, Sergey played rook b7 here, allowing bishop e6 check, king h8, and bishop f8. And now this is completely winning, because bishop f7 is a threat, and after f5, now that the pawn is on g4, white can take with the pawn, and this setup cannot really be shaken, and white wins quite straightforwardly. The easiest plan is to play h5. Let's say if black passes, the easiest plan, I believe, is just to play h5, followed up by f6. Then you take on h6, you put the king back to g6, you play h6, and bishop g7 mate will follow. So with the f-pawn still alive, there's never going to be any stalemates, and this is a very, very straightforward plan which cannot really be stopped. But instead of this, Magnus blitzed out bishop d6, king h8, bishop f8, king g8. Here he could still play something like bishop c5, cutting off the squares from the black rook, king h8, bishop e6, and maybe he once again gets this setup with the bishop on f8. It's not 100% clear, but it does feel like white will once again get the ideal setup. But Magnus continued playing very quickly and eventually pinned himself on the 7th, allowing a very well-known drawing mechanism. Black doubled the white pawns on the h and then just gave up the rook for the dark squared bishop, and this is an immediate draw because there is no progress to be made on the king side anymore with the h pawns. So the second game was also drawn, and the scores remained level at 1 point apiece, with this now being an extremely short 2-game rapid micro match. And we come to game 3, in which Sergey was once again white, and it was once again a 6d3 Spanish, in which Magnus was once again the first to change up. He played, no, sorry, that's actually incorrect. Magnus went back to the line he played in game 2 of the classical portion, and in that game white played d3, d4 here. But in the rapid game, Sergey went for b4, knight c6, and knight d5, which is an interesting option I personally wasn't really aware of. But both players continued playing very fast, and Magnus played knight d4 here, which is very similar to the line he played in game 11, I believe. But the difference is the knight on d4 threatens the bishop on b3, and also the pawn stays on b2 if you compare this position with this position. And I specifically mentioned the fact that the bishop is not hanging because Sergey now chose a move which really doesn't exist at all in the previous position, knight g5. Because knight takes b3 is not a legal move, and black needs to go for a different change of structure. Bishop takes d5, e5, I believe, is the best way to proceed here. And from here, Magnus went for an incredibly committal plan, which I still am not sure how I think the resulting position is assessed. He could start by playing a5 here, c3, knight f5, aiming to transfer this knight probably via h4 to g6, and only then play knight d7. This is a very typical transfer of this knight because it really isn't doing very much on f5. It mainly gets in the way of your other pieces for black here. And once it lands on g6, you can start expanding on the king's side because g6 is a useful square for this piece. Instead of all this, Magnus went for a very, very sharp and very, very forcing sequence. He played knight d7, knight e4 is the obvious reply here. f5, knight g2, and now the only move that doesn't lose the d4 knight to the threat of c2, c3 is what Magnus played, f4, c3, knight f5. And here, it was very difficult for us during the live commentary to decide what we even think about this position. It is extremely complicated, and play becomes, like, every single decision here matters a great deal, because White obviously has a lot of trumps. He has the square on e4 for his pieces. He has the couple of bishops, and especially if he manages to somehow activate the bishop, which is currently not doing anything at all on a2, he should be doing quite well. And in particular, in connection with that assessment, we felt that White's most testing plan here would be something connected with the idea of playing rook e1 and following it up by knight f3, bishop b1, and trying to play d3, d4 as early as possible to challenge the black center and to include the bishop on a2 in the game as soon as possible. And this would have led to very, very unclear positions. I still don't really know what to think about this. This is a very unusual structure which you don't see very often. The setup with the pawn on d5 does happen in a lot of these positions, but White pawn is normally on b2, not on b4, and that changes a number of things. Also, Black already played f5, f4, which is really not something Black generally does in these structures. Instead of this, Sergey played knight e4, and it does look very natural, but it sort of stops your own play in the center, because with a knight on e4 you don't really want to push d3, d4 necessarily, because Black will just take and you will have to settle on a different structure with double pawns on a d-file anyway. But in particular, we felt that after queen e8, bishop b3 and queen g6, Sergey's decision to play f3 here was perhaps unnecessary. It does look like Black is threatening something on the king side, but I think White could definitely wait for a while before committing to any kind of structure change. King h1 followed by rook g1, if forced, or maybe even if not forced, just to make sure g2 is never hanging, was very much an alternative here to what Sergey has done. He played f3, and this does create a huge target on e3, which you constantly will have to watch out for. If the knight lands there, it's obviously a very scary prospect in many cases. There's also the plan that Magnus immediately indicated. Bishop h4 followed by, in some cases, bishop g3, even with a pawn on h2, followed by queen h5 or queen h6. And after a4, knight f6, queen e2, it does feel like White is on the defensive here. And Magnus could continue playing directly on the king side, queen h5, bishop g3 next move. But he chose to open the second front here by playing a5, which is a very interesting idea and a good idea, I believe, but some of his follow-up was perhaps not the best. Sergey chose to take on b5. He could also take on a5 and play something like rook a2, hoping to trade some more pieces off on the queen side. But after takes, and bishop takes, Black can still take on d5. He can also just play something like rook b8 and claim that he has active pieces all over the board, and White will have to defend, which I think is true. A b5, a b4, and here White has three options: rook a8 followed by c b4, or bishop b2, or bishop d2, which is what Sergey played. And after bishop d2, we during the live show we really liked keeping everything where it is for Black and playing something like queen h5 to give White the widest variety of options. Sergey was running somewhat short on time here, and we felt that not committing to any structure changes here would be beneficial for Black, because it's not that easy to make a move for White here. Black maybe doesn't have any immediate winning threats, but because the bishop is on d2 and not on b2, taking on g4 doesn't really look very attractive at all, and therefore it's not that easy to suggest a positive plan of action here. Instead of this, Magnus took on c3, making sure that Sergey takes with the bishop because there's really no other move, and played knight e3, once again driving one of White's pieces to a very good square. Takes, queen e8, trying to include the queen in the game. bishop c4, king h8. Black is still very, very comfortable, but it does feel like white perhaps settled down a little bit, and the position should not be all that horrible. Although you probably still pick black if you have to choose. But Sergey made a very interesting choice here. He left himself, I think, maybe even less than 3 minutes and took on f6. To which Magnus instantly replied by taking with the bishop, which surprised us a great deal because gf6 with the very simple threat of rook g8 seemed incredibly strong here. If you play something like g3, you probably just get mated on the king side, followed by bishop takes g3. And if you play bishop d2, which I guess white was planning to do, to at least chase away the knight from e3, the knight gets transferred to another very, very useful square, knight c2 with a tempo, rook goes somewhere, the knight lands on d4, and then you play rook g8, queen h5. And I would not be at all surprised if it turned out that the white king side just collapses here. This position looks incredibly dangerous, in particular if you consider that Sergey would have to hold it on very, very limited time. But after bishop f6 and rook a3, it feels like white should be having a much easier time of it. And here Magnus played a very interesting positional sacrifice of a pawn. d4 is almost the only move here. Bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, queen e5, rook c1. You can also play queen d2, but this was a move Sergey was surprisingly reluctant to play, and there will be additional moments later in the game where I think this move would have been very, very decent. Rook c1. Already here I think black should start by playing queen d4, but Magnus played rook a8, h3, and once again not queen d4 here but h6. And in this position in particular I think queen d4 followed by bishop e4, maybe even bishop f1 to make sure nothing ever hangs, would I think keep this position together quite decently for white. And with the queen on g2 finally keeping some kind of an eye over the dark squares, I think white probably would have been able to make sure nothing bad is happening here. Instead, Sergey played king h2, queen d4, and this already is a little bit tricky. The machine, for instance, suggests that if you play bishop d3, rook a3, bishop b1, rook b3, which looks very, very threatening. Rook b2 is a huge threat, and so on. White apparently can play e5 here, creating his own attacking ideas. And after queen takes e5, you can play b6, even allowing knight g4 check, because the Excelsior pawn just wins for white completely. But seeing all this in what was serious time trouble for Sergey is not at all easy. And he made a move which is an interesting option. It creates the idea of queen c3. If you take the bishop, it gets picked up back immediately, and white is doing very well. But it has a tactical drawback. Black plays queen b2, bishop f1, rook a2, and now that black actually assumed control over the second file, this is now very, very unpleasant for white. But still it was unnecessary probably to lose this position in one move. You could still play rook b1. After queen f6 you probably absolutely have to find the only move bishop e2, but it's not impossible to understand that the only way to protect the g2 pawn is this setup. And black still needs to prove that he is winning. Instead of all this, Sergey took on c7, and after rook a1 had to immediately resign because he loses the queen and then will continue losing material because the pawn on g2 is just too weak. And with that victory, Magnus led in the match for the very first time, and the situation before game 4 was very simple. Sergey needed to play this game sharply for a win with black. And this is a situation he found himself in, I believe, yeah, at least twice during, for instance, his final match in the Baku World Cup against yours truly. And I was pretty confident that he will switch from e4, e5 to a Sicilian, and this is what happened. Knight f3, d6. And here Magnus actually deviated from something he normally does in this position, even when he doesn't need to make a draw with white. He generally doesn't allow the knight and plays bishop b5 check. But today he opted for d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, and the move 5 of 3, which is very well known. It's a very well known option which gives white a lot of control over structures in the center, and generally is considered to be very, very safe, and perhaps even promising for white if he knows what he's doing. White wants to play c2, c4 next move, and this is why black generally plays e5, knight b3, and then this source of immediate counterplay here is playing a5 followed by a4, trying to drive the white pieces away from good squares. But this is the setup that I think a lot of games now feature that are played in this variation. Knight c1, I think, is an improvement over what I think used to be considered the absolutely necessary move, knight 3 d2. And after knight c1, white generally gets very, very comfortable positions, and this is also what happened in this game. Castles, knight c3, queen a5, queen g2. And here, a recent game in the Russian superfinal between, I believe, Aparin and Kokarev went knight c6, rook b1, bishop e6, and white played b4 here anyway, and had a very pleasant advantage with no risk whatsoever. And perhaps mindful of that, Sergey went for a different plan. He played knight a6, followed by knight c5, bishop d7, and the knight eventually went to e6. But of course, this is not an improvement over what black is normally doing in this line. It's just an attempt for black to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, hoping that eventually white will have to force the issue, and by that point both of them should be in severe time trouble, and then something might happen. But it's incredibly difficult for black to create any kind of positive ideas here. Knight b4 played, bishop c6, rook fd1. Here Sergey started on pretty much the only source of counterplay he can create immediately, pushing the h-pawn down the board to create maybe some squares for his pieces on the king side. Bishop f1, h4, queen f2, knight d7, because you need to cover the b6 square. If you go knight h5, let's say knight bd5, the threat of knight b6 will be incredibly unpleasant. Knight d7, and here Magnus chose a very interesting approach. He could sort of keep a holding pattern here quite well, or even play something like knight bd5 was, I think, a very sensible option. But he chose to play g3, weakening his king side somewhat, but also creating a very useful square for the bishop on f1, which was maybe the one piece that wasn't really participating in the game. So g3, rook a3. We were expecting Sergey to play bishop g5 here. But even then, although it probably is a stronger move than what he opted for, even something very simple like bishop h3 takes, knight d4 and king g2 followed by a knight c3 to is probably good enough for white to keep complete control over what will happen in this game, because the knight on d4 will get driven back, and this is a monstrous bishop which does a lot of work on h3. After rook a3, Magnus played bishop h3, rook a8. And here a somewhat curious sequence, but a very strong one, considering the match situation in particular. Knight c2, rook a6 is the only move, because rook a5 b4 just loses a piece on the spot. Rook a6, knight b4, rook a5, and here knight c2 back, once again reminding black that before b5 is a huge threat the way his pieces are currently positioned. b6 is strictly the only move if you don't want to lose material. And now, objectively, black really has no counterplay whatsoever, in particular with the pawn on b6, which is constantly hanging in many variations, and also is no longer supporting the bishop on c6, so white always has this additional tempo to do something on the queen side by playing knight b4 and attacking the bishop on c6. Magnus took some time here trying to figure out how to proceed, and decided not to go for anything forcing, and played rook g2. Black played queen c7, in a position where black really has no active ideas, and the only hope for black really is to play fast and hope that white will start committing mistakes when the time trouble becomes really, really critical. It was very telling that Sergey took about 5 minutes, I believe, to play queen c7 here, which is really counterproductive sort of for the future, to burn so much time on a move which is frankly not changing anything in the position. But it's just incredibly difficult to play this for black, because there really aren't any active plans anymore. Rook bd1, bishop f8, and here Magnus decided that enough is enough, and it's time to start converting his advantage into something material, and he has taken on h4. This decision was not entirely unexpected. It's quite clearly a strong move. You win a pawn, you no longer have to worry about, it's no longer there. You can maybe even play along the g file later. Also, you control more or less the entire board, apart from now giving black the f4 square. But then you can simplify very seriously by trading both of your bishops for both of the knights. And this is what happened in the game. Knight f4, white takes both knights off. And in this position, once again, you could go sort of full grid mode by taking on b6. The tactical justification for it is that after d5 you have the move b4, which stops bishop c5 check. But Magnus went for a more practical route. He played knight b4, hoping to establish one of the knights on d5, rook a3. The machine suggests that white can actually switch to attack mode here by playing like this with a very large threat of, like, I think if queen takes c4, this is probably close to mate, with the idea of rook h5 check, which cannot really be adequately stopped. But instead of this, Magnus went for a more prosaic approach, so to speak. He played knight b5, and here Sergey probably would have a... I'm not honestly sure which move gives him the biggest practical chance to create an unclear position. Let's say rook a1, after which white can make a useful waiting move, and he is just a pawn up, and the knight will eventually probably return and go to d5. Or the move rook takes b3, which he had chosen, which gives up the exchange for two pawns. But here I guess black can at least hope that if the bishop from f8 gets active, and if he manages to transfer it to some kind of a useful square, he will have lots of counterplay. But white, of course, is not obliged to allow that. Queen e2, bishop e7, king g2, queen e6, h5. There are options for both sides here which you could discuss, but what you need to know about this position is that objectively, of course, white is much better, maybe even winning, and he just needed to make sure he doesn't miss any important tactics and continues playing reasonably fast so that he doesn't fall too far behind on the clock. By this point, I think Magnus lost some of his time advantage, but was still doing quite comfortably on the clock against an opponent who was playing more or less consistently on below a minute. And rook a3, rook d3, this was perhaps the last moment where black could have created some uncomfortable situation for white by playing queen c4. The idea being that if you play rook 3 d2, the queen might go to some better squares. I'm not sure which ones, but some better squares. And if you go rook 1 d2, black can play, let's say, rook a1, rook d1, rook a2, and now after rook d1, now that the queen is not protected, you can play rook a5, and white does not have the move rook d5. Because once the rook actually lands on d5, it will be almost impossible for black to create serious counterplay. But this is what Sergey has done. He played rook a2, rook d3, rook a3, rook d3, and once again failed to play queen c4 here, played rook a7. And now that the rook is on d5, it is a lot easier for white to control outcomes here. And at this moment, I think it became quite clear that white probably will just win this game. But the finish that Magnus eventually settled on is still extremely spectacular. Rook c7, Magnus goes after the f4 pawn, queen f6, rook f5, queen h4. You can take even here, but Magnus occupies the c file first, which is a very sensible decision. Black, of course, cannot trade any pieces, so rook a7, queen takes f4, rook a2 check. Queen takes f4 had taken Magnus, I think, maybe a minute and a half to play. He did spend some time here. And by this point, live on air, me and Jan managed to figure out the line that happened in the game. And then I argued very, very strongly that it will never happen on the board, because white is so completely winning without it that Magnus will never really even consider not converting this in a driest technical way possible. But boy, was I proven wrong. The only way to continue here, because otherwise the queens are exchanged, is to play rook a2 check, king h1, queen f2. And in this position, if you play queen g3, the attack is over, and in fact you can argue that it is white who will be attacking on the queen side after something like, I don't know, queen d2, rook g1. And white will start pushing on the queen side now, and there will never be a single threat on the king side, and there will be never be a single threat on the king side from black, because this setup controls everything. But it's quite clear that Magnus calculated this all when he was playing queen takes f4, and of course he knew queen g3 is winning. But in this position it had taken him something like 10 seconds to play rook c8 check, king h7, and now white actually loses, if not for queen h6 check. And this is a fantastic finish for a deciding game of the World Championship match. It's not that hard to see, I guess, sort of in the privacy of your own home when you're looking at this position dispassionately. But instead of queen g3, to play rook c8 and queen h6 check, when you know that if you made a mistake somewhere, if for instance this for some miraculous reason is not made, although of course it is, but if it isn't, you will get mated on the other side of the board. So you are, I wouldn't call it a risk, but it's a mark of tremendous style to finish with queen h6 check. And in some way, perhaps it's regrettable that Sergey just resigned here instead of allowing either this or this. This is a matter of taste, which one you like better. And with this finish, with this mate on board, pretty much, Magnus won the rapid tiebreak with a score of 3-1, and with that successfully defended his title for the second time. Very, I think, impressive play in the deciding part of the match from Magnus. He had much the better of the running in the rapid playoff, and he did manage to equal the scores after falling behind by losing game 8. But also a lot of credit has to be given to Sergey Karjakin, who came into the match, I think, sort of universally accepted as a large underdog, and led the classical portion with four games to go, and actually was very, very close to winning game 9 after outplaying Magnus in it quite convincingly, and being frankly one precise calculation away from probably converting his advantage and leading by 2 games with 3 to go, which probably, well, incredibly likely would have been decisive. So a very, very tense match, a match which probably featured both of them not at their absolute best, although defensive capabilities that Sergey once again demonstrated throughout the match, including the second rapid game today, were spectacular. But I think both of them will feel that they have played better chess in their lives. But a tremendously tense match, which must have taken a lot out of them and was very interesting to watch and to commentate. And with that, the only thing that remains is to congratulate Magnus Carlsen on defending his title, and also not that he particularly needs any of that with this result, but to wish him a happy birthday as well. And also, as I already mentioned, I think Sergey deserves a lot of praise for the fighting spirit he had once again shown throughout the match, and for running Magnus very, very close. And with that, I probably say goodbye to the Chess24 viewers for a while. This concludes my part in covering this match. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for watching all of this and keeping us alive in the dark hours of the night. It's been a pleasure. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.